Throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition.
I like him a lot, but you know what they did was wrong. He was very nice. He apologized for what they did with the commercial, because it was a false commercial. You know, it was the exact opposite. Ronald Reagan loved tariffs, and they tried to make it look.
You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing and stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in world markets.
President Trump is delaying a planned tariff hike on imported furniture and cabinets, keeping current duties in place while trade talks continue. Now, the delay comes under a proclamation tied to national security concerns over foreign wood product imports. The tariff increase, originally set for January 2026, is now pushed back 1 year. The current tariff of 25%, though, will remain in effect. The White House says predatory foreign government subsidies on imported lumber and predatory trade practices undermine the competitiveness of the American wood products industry.
Breaking update in the Canada-US trade confrontation. The White House announced a 1-year delay on certain tariff increases hitting Canadian exports. This is especially furniture and kitchen cabinets. On the surface, that sounds like relief. In reality, it confirms something more unsettling. Canada is being moved into a permanent negotiation where economic security isn't a right. It's a condition that can be renewed, paused, or withdrawn on command. Here's the clean backstory, because the timeline matters. Months earlier, in October 2025, an Ontario-funded TV advertisement aired briefly during U.S. broadcasts. It used Ronald Reagan's voice to warn that tariffs kill jobs. The ad was pulled, but the political shockwave stayed. Donald Trump publicly responded by announcing a halt to trade negotiations with Canada, framing the incident as interference and misrepresentation. Whatever you think of the ad, the signal from Washington was unmistakable. In this relationship, symbolic messaging can trigger real economic consequences. Now hold on to 2 receipts, 2 evidence flashes, because they anchor everything that follows. Evidence Flash 1. The U.S. halts Canada trade talks after Ontario ad. 1 sentence. A communication moment became a trade weapon overnight, proving the relationship can be frozen by politics, not economics. Evidence Flash 2. Tariff hikes delayed for 1 year. Tariffs remain. 1 sentence. The pressure didn't end. It was recalibrated, keeping the uncertainty alive while appearing to offer relief. Here's the key point. The delay is not the story. The story is what the delay means. And what it means is this. The U.S. doesn't need to win one tariff battle to dominate the trade field. It can simply keep Canada inside a fog of threat, always negotiating, always reacting, always exposed. Let's make it plain. The halt in negotiations didn't quickly dissolve into normal diplomacy. It hardened into a lingering freeze that left businesses, policymakers, and markets planning around risk instead of rules. Tariff threats continued to circulate, including talk of a blanket tariff as high as 35% on Canadian goods. Canada, unable to force the United States back to the table on its own terms, found itself navigating strategic limbo. And limbo is not neutral. In an asymmetric relationship, limbo is leverage. Watch the mechanism. The U.S. economy is larger and more diversified. It can absorb uncertainty more easily. Canada can't, not because Canada is poor, but because Canada is structurally dependent on U.S. market access. That dependency doesn't just shape trade, it shapes bargaining power. The party that can walk away, even temporarily, controls the temperature of the room. Now we get to the 2026 twist. The 1-year delay on certain tariff increases. On paper, it looks like de-escalation. But in the broader context, it reads like a tactical pause, pressure management, not reconciliation. The negotiations remain politically fragile. The threat environment remains intact. and the underlying tensions haven't been resolved. That matters because businesses can survive tariffs they can predict. What they can't survive, at least not without changing behavior, is policy that behaves like weather, sudden, unpredictable, and designed to keep you cautious. Here's the micro reset. In modern trade conflict, uncertainty is not a side effect. It's a product. The economic consequences of this kind of prolonged uncertainty are already visible. Analysts warn that a breakdown in stable trade expectations raises costs across integrated supply chains, especially in sectors like automotive and manufactured goods. Parts and components cross the border multiple times before final assembly. When talks are frozen and threats keep reappearing, uncertainty spreads through factories, retailers, and logistics networks. Canadian exporters face the risk of sudden escalation. U.S. consumers face higher prices and slower deliveries. The auto sector is especially vulnerable because even small disruptions can ripple across a continent. Now here's where Liberation Lens begins, because the deeper structure matters more than the headline. Canada depends heavily on U.S. market access, but the U.S. also depends on Canadian inputs for its manufacturing base. That's the irony. Both sides lose when politics overrides economic logic. Efficiency drops. Costs rise. Planning collapses. But in an asymmetric relationship, the dominant partner can tolerate inefficiency longer because it's not just an economic contest, it's a leverage contest. And that's why the Ontario ad episode matters beyond the ad itself. The ad wasn't an economic event, it was a political message. But in a world where politics and trade are fused, a political message can trigger continental consequences because trade tools are now part of political theater. Here's another micro reset. In this era, trade agreements don't guarantee stability. They create arenas where power tests limits. Which takes us to the approaching 2026 USMCA CUSMA review, the real structural risk on the horizon. The review is legally mandated. It's built into the agreement. It can't simply be wished away. But the political climate surrounding it has grown more hostile, more volatile, and more performative. A review designed to ensure stability can become a platform for escalation, especially if one side enters emboldened and the other enters anxious. And one crucial thing remains right. The months-long freeze exposes the asymmetry in bargaining power. The United States can afford to suspend, delay, threaten, and pivot because it has options. Canada cannot, because its economy is integrated, geographically tied, and historically routed through the U.S. market. The U.S. can threaten blanket tariffs. Canada can retaliate selectively. The U.S. can absorb price increases. Canada faces disproportionate risk. This is not a moral claim, it's a structural claim. It's what happens when dependency meets coercion. Now let's tighten the tariff delay meaning, because this is where your argument becomes most valuable. A one-year delay sounds like relief, but it functions like a time-bound bargaining chip. Businesses don't plan investments on temporary pauses. They plan on predictable rules. So when a delay is announced without restoring stability, it doesn't remove pressure, it simply changes the shape of pressure. Think of it like this. The industry gets a stay of execution, not a cure. The wound is still open. The bleeding is just managed. The delay becomes a bandage on a wound that can still be cut deeper at any moment. Companies may delay hiring. They may hold back on expansion. They may shift production. They may reroute suppliers. Not because the tariffs happened, but because the rules feel unstable. The delay becomes a signal that your fate can be moved by proclamation. Here's the micro reset. The most expensive tariff is the one that forces you to redesign your future. Now, zoom out further, because the trade story sits inside a bigger political economy. What we're watching isn't only a dispute over rates and sectors. We're watching a shift toward managed volatility, a style of power where the dominant actor doesn't need to break the relationship. It can keep the relationship technically alive while continuously extracting concessions, compliance, and deference through uncertainty. This is how sovereignty gets weakened without a single tank crossing a border. The weaker partner spends its political capital not to gain new ground, but to preserve ground it already had. It negotiates defensively. It bargains for normalcy. and that is the quiet conversion of prosperity into vulnerability. Now bring the Ontario ad back into focus, because it's not just a trigger. It's a warning about fragility. If a single advertisement can become a flashpoint that helps justify halting talks, what does that say about the stability of the relationship? What does it say about how easily trade policy can be weaponized? And what does it say about the boundary between domestic political messaging and international economic consequences? In an era where information moves faster than diplomacy, the boundary between internal politics and external punishment becomes dangerously thin. Here's the micro reset. When communication becomes a weapon, markets stop behaving like markets and start behaving like hostages. Now let's be fair about the US. Side 2, because power often injures itself. For the United States, halting talks can produce short-term political theater, but it carries long-term economic risks. Higher prices hit consumers. Higher input costs hit manufacturers. Supply disruption hits retailers. And alienating your closest trading partner is not cost-free, especially when global supply chains are already strained. But again, this is the structural point. The dominant player can accept more self-harm if the political reward is leverage. That's what asymmetry means in practice. For Canada, the halted talks and rolling threats create a strategic crisis. Canada must prepare for the USMCA review in a hostile environment. It must reassure business confidence while the relationship sends contradictory signals. It must decide whether to retaliate, de-escalate, or accelerate diversification, knowing each path has costs. And this is where your story becomes bigger than Canada. Because what Canada is experiencing is what many resource-rich but structurally dependent economies experience across the world. A powerful partner can turn access into pressure, and pressure into policy outcomes. So what's the action point? What does a viewer do with this? First, stop treating the tariff delay as relief. Treat it as a signal. The relationship is being governed by calibration, not stability. Second, watch the lead up to the USMCA CUSMA review like you'd watch a storm track. Not because the review itself is dramatic, but because the leverage environment around it is. The question isn't whether the review happens. The question is, what gets attached to it? They include dairy disputes, digital taxation fights, rules of origin battles, procurement pressures, security framing, whatever becomes useful as bargaining material. Third, watch whether temporary pauses become the new normal. Because if delays replace durable rules, then uncertainty becomes institutionalized. And institutionalized uncertainty is a form of control. Here's the final micro reset. The real threat isn't a tariff. It's a system where stability must be purchased again and again. The Ontario ad may have been the spark, but the fire was already burning. And that's the deeper truth about modern trade conflict. It is not governed by treaties alone. It is governed by power, perception, and political will. In that environment, even a symbolic message can become a lever, and a lever can reshape the economic future of two nations. So here's the takeaway. Canada is not just facing tariffs. Canada is facing a new trade reality, one where time, uncertainty, and pauses are used as bargaining chips to keep the weaker side permanently negotiating. If this changed how you see the headlines, drop a comment. Do you think Canada has any real leverage going into the USMCA review? Or is diversification the only long-term escape route? Share this with someone still treating this as normal trade politics. This is Liberation Lens. We don't just report the news, we translate the script of power. If this breakdown sharpened your perspective, share it, drop your take in the comments, and subscribe, because what's coming next is the USMCA review, where this leverage system becomes policy on paper. See you there.